Bob Costas, Hall of Fame broadcaster, was on the call 25 years ago tonight. We thought Michael Jordan's final shot, and Bob has said that that was not exactly a push-off by Michael Jordan. That's like a maitre d' showing you to your table. Bob, I've never been shown to my table by a maitre d' where I nearly fell over. So I'm gonna disagree with that description.
Yeah, but Dan, he wasn't falling because of the very light push. He was already stumbling because Michael had faked him out of his sneakers. That's kind of what happened. If that happens in the second quarter of a regular season game, nobody even disputes. No one turns and says, hey, wait, that was a push-off. Nothing. It's because of where it happened, who it happened to, one of the most iconic moments in the history of sports. Forget about the NBA. If Utah has a gripe, and they do in that game, there was no replay then. In the first half, Howard Eisley hit a three that was waved off as a shot clock violation, and we had it on NBC. It's out of his hands before the clock hits zero. So that's 3 points taken away from Utah. Later in the game, Ron Harper hits a two that did not beat the shot clock, and it was allowed. Now, that's a 5 point. That's a 5 point swing. Of course, when people say it's like, oh, well, if that guy wasn't thrown out trying to steal second base and the next guy homers, it would have been a two-run homer. That's not necessarily logical because if the circumstances are different, maybe what happens subsequently plays out differently. But in a game that was that close, you take 5 points away from Utah, they have a case that maybe they could have played a Game 7 in Utah a few nights later.
And I also go back to the play that's forgotten, and it's equally as impressive as Jordan's steal on Karl Malone that led to the game-winning shot.
Yeah, he's being guarded by Rodman, and according to Michael's subsequent testimony, he came around from the side, and Malone never saw him. Michael left his guy along the baseline, and Malone is preoccupied with Rodman, and Michael comes from the other side and slaps it away.
Yeah, and then that led to, 5 seconds to go where he hits the jumper. As you guys were game planning, after he makes the steal, and then there's a timeout, I believe, and then what is being discussed by you guys in the anticipation? Because we've seen Steve Kerr hit a game-winning shot, John Paxson hit a game-winning shot. Is everybody in unison that this is going to be Michael Jordan taking the shot?
Yeah, pretty much, because when he stole the ball, he then has it, and no one else touched it. And when you think about it, what's surprising about that? Pippen's hobbling around with a bad back. He's Michael Jordan. He's going to take that shot. He didn't pass it to anybody. He had it the whole time. He took it out of the backcourt into the front court, made the shot over Russell. But when he makes the shot, there's 5.2 seconds left. So even though the Bulls are up by one, whatever you say, the possibility that this is a championship-winning shot, the possibility that it's the last shot Michael Jordan will ever take in his NBA career, which briefly turned out to be true until he came back with the Wizards for an encore, that's a possibility, but it's certainly not a certainty because there's still 5 seconds left, and Utah could score. And Stockton got a decent look. Harper was guarding him, as I remember. Had a hand in his face. He got a decent look, and as I remember, it hit the back iron, but it was kind of on target. So if that goes in, they play a Game 7 on Utah's home floor.
Take us back, and I apologize. I thought for some reason when Jordan made the steal that they would have called a timeout then. But,
no timeout.
Yeah, that's interesting strategy, but, strategy always helps when you have Michael Jordan. We're talking to Bob Costas, who was on the call. Let's go back to the flu game. What did you know prior to the game as, Michael's condition and why he was in that condition?
I didn't work the 97 playoffs. I had taken a hiatus courtesy of my good friend and patron, Dick Ebersol. So Marv's doing the game, and I think Hannah Storm's doing the pre and post. Of course, I watched every minute of it, and I find out later, and it's a big part of The Last Dance, did he have the flu or did he have food poisoning? And if you've ever had food poisoning, Dan, which I have had a couple of times, that's as bad as you can feel knowing for a fact that you will not die.
Yeah.
So if it was food poisoning, I think it's even worse than if he had merely had, quote, the flu.
When you think of Jordan's career, It's almost like it grows. It's like Babe Ruth. It tends to grow.
Yep.
It metastasizes.
Mm-hmm.
They're just, what is it about that? Like Mickey Mantle's legacy. There's so many of these athletes where you may not remember them being as great as they were in the moment, but then as we kind of move farther and farther away, does LeBron get the benefit of this, do you think, the way Michael Jordan has?
No, not as much, through no fault of LeBron's. You can make a very strong statistical case for LeBron in a LeBron-Michael comparison. And LeBron, discounting centers, because I've always felt, we've talked about this before, they're in a separate category. How do you compare Wilt or Russell or Kareem or Olajuwon or a healthy Bill Walton or whomever? Or Shaq? How do you compare them to forwards and guards? But LeBron never comes out these days any worse than number 2 behind Jordan in that comparison. But what LeBron does not have is as many iconic moments that are replayed almost on a loop and are in everyone's imagination, including those who didn't see it firsthand, going all the way back to the game-winning shot for North Carolina in '82 against Georgetown, and then being the centerpiece of the first Dream Team, and then all those postseason moments, most of them in the finals, but even the shot on Elo in an earlier round of the playoffs against the Cavaliers. So many of those moments, and the iconic commercials, Be Like Mike, and just thinking about the game we're talking about now, that is still the highest-rated game in NBA history. And the ratings for those games during the 80s and 90s on CBS, Bird, Magic, and then during the 80s on CBS, then in the 90s on NBC, the ratings for those games generally dwarf the ratings that NBA games get now, and many of those NBA games are on cable rather than over-the-air broadcast television. And that will diminish, not objectively, but in terms of the public imagination, that doesn't just diminish LeBron in comparison to Jordan or Bird or Magic. It will diminish Nikola Jokic. It will diminish Jimmy Butler or whomever you want to name through no fault of their own.
It's like Michael is Neil Armstrong. He's the first on the moon. And
That's right.
Everybody else may land there, but Mike was the first there to plant the flag. Bob will be doing an hour-long interview with Albert Pujols later today for MLB Network, and air to be determined there. A couple of baseball questions. We're well into the pitch clock. How do you feel?
I think in general, all the changes have been tremendously successful. I've had a few players and managers tell me that they think 15 seconds with no one on base is a little quick, and they'd prefer a uniform 20 seconds. Nobody on and with men on base, a uniform 20 seconds. But I haven't heard anybody dispute the general idea that the pitch clock, banning shifts, the 2 pickoff throws per at-bat, which lets a base runner be a bit more adventurous, it's nearly unanimous that this is not just okay, but it's a rousing success.
The A's moving to Vegas, does Vegas take the A's out of the – they're taking the A's out of Oakland, but do they take the nickname?
Well, if they keep the nickname, then the A's become the first team in MLB history to have the same name in 4 different locations. Breaking a tie they had with the Braves. The Braves and the A's are the only ones with 3. The Braves were in Boston, in Milwaukee, and now for a long time in Atlanta. And the A's were in Philadelphia, Kansas City, Oakland, and now perhaps in Vegas. But last night, I'm sure you saw this, Dan, and maybe you mentioned it earlier this morning. The A's had a reverse boycott night or whatever they were calling
protest.
It last night. The fans came out, and the idea was let's fill the stadium or at least have much larger crowds than we've generally been drawing to show that there's support there if we had reason to have faith in the team. And then throughout the game, they're chanting, sell the team. Meanwhile, this team that was threatening the worst record of all time for a season, like making the 62 Mets look like a juggernaut, now they've won 7 straight, so go figure.
And the Angels are still in the playoff race, which means as we get closer to the trade deadline, if you're tempted to trade Shohei Ohtani, it makes it even harder because you're in the playoff race. What do you think happens with Ohtani?
I don't think they trade him. And if they were to trade him, it would make the haul that the Nats got for sending Juan Soto to San Diego look like a pittance. I mean, you'd have to empty your entire farm system, all your top prospects, plus throw in some players that can be useful right now. I don't see that happening. Plus, there's only a handful of teams that are realistically in the mix if he decides to leave the Angels and sign with some other team as a free agent. So why would those teams want to empty their farm system if the real test is going to come as to how much money they're willing to pay him on a 10-year deal or whatever it is to sign a contract with them? And some team that has no chance to sign him beyond that time, I don't think is going to roll the dice and pay the price it would take for a midseason trade just to have a shot at a second or third wild card spot. Just doesn't seem to add up.
Great to talk to you as always, Bob. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
That's Bob Costas, Hall of Fame broadcaster, working for MLB Network, and was the play-by-play voice of the NBA on NBC from 1997 through 1999-2000 season. And I thought when Jordan made the steal that there was a timeout, and Phil Jackson let him go in transition, and then he hits the jumper there.